Ugreen has entered the NAS market and I've been having a play. While a fairly well-known brand in the electronics space, their NAS lineup has been available for less than a year. In that time, it has already seen a lot of updates to the software. But does it have what it takes to stand out against well-entrenched competitors? Let's find out. Disclosure before we go further, Ugreen sent this NAS to me to test. I did not pay for it, they have not paid me. I have promised them nothing. They will see this video at the same time you do. If you want to support the channel, however, there will be links in the video description. The specific product I have in front of me is a Ugreen NASSync DXP 4800 Plus. Let's begin with the tour of the hardware. The most obvious feature are the 4 lockable 3.5-inch SATA drive bays at the front, supporting up to 24TB each. These are toolless if using 3.5-inch drives, although they will also accept 2.5-inch. On the underside are 2 NVMe SSD slots for additional storage, or to use as high-speed cache so you can mix SSDs with mechanical drives for a balance of performance and capacity. NVMe drives up to 8TB are supported, giving the NAS a total maximum storage capacity of 112TB. The front I/O panel shows network and disk status next to the power button and provides a mix of connectivity in the form of USB Type-A, USB Type-C, and an SD card slot. Both front panel USB ports will do up to 10 gigabits per second. Around the back is another USB port that supports up to 5 gigabits a second. The 2 remaining USB ports are USB 2. I would consider them more for peripheral attachment than for fast data transfer. There is an HDMI port to connect a monitor or TV, a power jack, and 2 Ethernet ports. This Ethernet port supports speeds of up to 2.5 gigabits per second. The other one? It'll hit 10 gigabits a second. That's a lot of gigabits. It came loaded with 8 gigs of RAM with a spare slot to add more. The maximum supported memory is 64 gigabytes. The processor is an Intel Pentium Gold 8505. This is a 12th gen Intel CPU with 1 hyper-threaded performance core, 4 efficiency cores, and a maximum turbo frequency of 4.4 GHz. This is the higher performing of Ugreen's 4x NASes, and should really be considered more of a home server than just a NAS. As far as noise goes, I found the NAS itself to be pretty quiet in default settings, although if you run the fan at full tilt you will notice. Realistically, if you're loading it with mechanical drives, those are going to be the loudest part of the system and not the NAS itself. Let me give you my first impressions before we compare the specs. I've only had this for a few weeks, so I can't make any claims about long-term reliability, but I did get a sense that the team who worked in this cares about quality. It feels well built and robust, but what stood out to me was the detail in the little things. The front I/O has been thoughtfully chosen to provide multiple options for data ingestion. As a content creator, I appreciate the inclusion of an SD card slot that I can use to quickly ingest footage from my camera. The traditional front-to-back airflow has been reversed. The rear fan on this NAS acts as an intake, where in most others it would be an exhaust. This allowed Ugreen to add a dust filter on the intake, and the resulting positive air pressure will also help prevent dust ingress through the gaps at the front. This cover is magnetic, so it can be removed for easy cleaning. You will need screws if using 2.5-inch drives, but the screws and the screwdriver are included. Speaking of screws, after opening the spring-assisted cover at the bottom to get at the NVMe slots, you can use the 2 included thermal pads to sink heat from your drives to the metal chassis. Finally, they include 2 Ethernet cables, both of which are rated for 10 gigabit. I doubt anyone's going to run out and buy a NAS because of a dust filter, but it's a good sign when they're paying attention to the small details. As for things that could be improved, the overall build feels robust, being made of pretty solid metal, except for the drive sleds. These are plastic. The toolless mechanism is easy to use, but I can't help wonder how that catch will hold up after several years being attached to a hot disk, when that disk inevitably dies and I have to replace it. It'll likely be fine, but I wonder if the moving parts could have been metal. The NVMe slots only have screws to fit 2280 size drives. This is the common size you would have almost certainly been buying anyway, but if you happen to have any smaller drives lying around spare from an old laptop or something, be aware there isn't a screw point for them. Moving on to the spec comparison, Ugreen has a selection of NASes in different sizes, but I will compare the 4x option seeing as that's what I've got here. Synology is probably the market leader in this particular segment, so let's see how Ugreen's 4x NASes stack up against Synology's 4x NASes. Compared to Synology, Ugreen's offering is on the pricey side, but if you look at the specs you can see why. Ugreen's hardware is on a different level. If you want a basic low-cost storage appliance, there are cheaper options. But if you want something that can double as a home server, Ugreen starts to look more interesting. Comparing the Ugreen DXP 4800 to the Synology DS423 Plus, you're paying 15 to 16% more, but getting 84% more CPU, 300% more RAM, and 150% more bandwidth. Comparing the Ugreen DXP 4800 Plus to the DS923 Plus, the gap gets wider still. It's worth noting that the Synology does have an optional 10GB card for the 923 Plus, but that adds another 110 or so quid to the price, making the Synology now the most expensive option, but still with half the RAM and around a third of the CPU horsepower compared to the now cheaper Ugreen unit. Just as I was recording this video, Synology released the DS925 Plus to replace the DS923 Plus, so depending on when you're watching this video, you might find one, the other, or both for sale. The new model has a faster CPU and it upgrades the dual 1GB network interfaces to dual 2.5GB. Unlike the outgoing DS923 Plus, you cannot upgrade it to 10GB though, 2.5 is the limit. Perhaps more importantly, the DS925 Plus and all future Synology NASs will require you to use Synology's own drives. You cannot just buy your own hard drives that you can with Ugreen or many other vendors. And yes, those Synology drives will be more expensive. This makes it pretty hard to recommend Synology and makes alternatives like Ugreen even more attractive. A closer comparison for Ugreen might be something more like a TerraMaster. These are loosely similar in terms of hardware and price to Ugreen's, but I can't really speak to their quality having never used one. The 10GB connectivity on this Ugreen box is its secret weapon. But how much bandwidth do you actually need? Well, that depends on what you plan to do with it. A 1GB connection will be a bottleneck. That said, it will be sufficient to stream media to your TV, share files, and back up your devices. Upgrading to 2.5GB will allow you to move files around more quickly and complete your backups faster. If you load this with mechanical hard drives, it can in theory saturate a 2.5GB network with long sequential reads across multiple disks, but in practice it's unlikely to be much of a constraint. Once you add in some flash storage though, even a single solid state drive can saturate 2.5GB, so if you're investing in flash storage and want to get the best possible performance out of it, 10GB is the way to go, provided of course the rest of your network supports it. The sort of use case where you'd probably want to upgrade to 10GB could be video editing. On a slower connection you'd likely have to copy the media from your NAS to your local machine, work on it, and then copy it back to the NAS when you're done. With 10GB, you could work directly from the NAS. Another scenario could be using your NAS as shared storage for a home lab server cluster. If you have several virtual machines all trying to read across a 2.5GB link, that's going to slow things down. I'm liking the hardware so far, but that's only part of the package, so it's time to look at the software. Ugreen's operating system is called UGOS Pro, and is based on the popular Debian Linux distribution. You can configure the NAS using a web browser or downloadable apps for Windows, Mac, Android or iPhone. I did not see an app for Linux, so you'll be limited to the web version. To use a web browser, plug in your NAS, turn it on, and navigate over to find.ugnas.com. Any NAS in your network should be displayed automatically. When you click on it, you're redirected to the local web interface of your device. From this point, all of the setup happens locally. You're connecting directly to your NAS. This is not Ugreen's website. For those of you who are especially concerned about privacy, I will link Ugreen's data collection list in the video description. They do collect some information to provide various services, but they list what they collect and why so you can decide for yourself before purchasing. What data they collect will depend on what services you use. For example, if you create a Ugreen account and use their servers to provide remote access to your NAS, you'll need to provide more information than if you handled the remote access yourself and disabled telemetry. To answer the most important question though, the data you put in your NAS stays in your NAS, and Ugreen cannot access it. For those of you who are a bit less trusting though, you can block outbound access on your firewall, install updates offline, and still use the NAS. Features that rely on the internet won't work, and you won't be able to use the Ugreen WebFind site. You can still connect your NAS's local address directly though. The Ugreen WebFind site doesn't do anything except redirect you to your local device anyway. The installable Windows and mobile apps will also work without your NAS having outbound access to the internet because they discover it using a local network broadcast. I'll quickly show you the setup process using the web interface. After accepting the user agreement and click Next, you can create a user account on your NAS. The next section is optional. This is to create a Ugreen account for remote access over the internet. If you want to keep everything local or set up your own remote access later, you can click Skip. After clicking Initialize, it will take a few minutes to sort itself out, and then you'll be taken to the desktop. If it appears to hang, it likely means your NAS is rebooted and picked up a different IP address from your router. I recommend setting a static IP or a DHCP reservation so your IP address doesn't change, but if in doubt, the Ugreen webfind site will point you back to your NAS. Once logged in, you get a few tips that point out key sections of the interface before being prompted to create a storage pool and volume. This device supports RAID levels 0, 1, 5, 6 and 10 as well as JBOD. Under the covers it's using standard Linux software RAID. Although you can choose Btrfs as a file system, the volume sits in MD RAID regardless. I won't cover the differences between RAID levels here. Each represents a different trade-off between performance, capacity and resilience, and they are industry standard terms that you can read up on. There is a description of each and a visual representation of how drive capacity gets used, but I recommend further reading because the descriptions here are a little bit off to me. For example, it's not clear that a disk failure in RAID 0 will result in the loss of all data on every disk, and the description of RAID 10 as N/2 appears to be getting used in reference to resilience when really that should be for capacity. RAID 10 is only guaranteed to survive a single disk failure, and beyond that it's just luck. The Learn More link does a much better job of explaining the differences, so use that if you're new to RAID. Once you've chosen your RAID level, your file system and created your volume, you're good to go. This percentage will slowly tick up over time. You don't need to wait for it to complete, but until it's finished, performance will be slower. Also in the storage section, you can view things like performance, configure health checks, and so on. The next thing I get prompted to do is create a shared folder. That's in this file section. There are a few types to choose from. I can create personal folders or shared folders, and give different people access to them. You can access these folders via the web interface or using Ugreen's apps. But being a NAS, there is of course support for multiple file sharing protocols. We can see the options under the file service in the control panel. The one most people will want is SMB. This will present your folders as a regular Windows file share. FTP is here, but if using it over the internet, make sure to enable FTPS and not plain old FTP, as the latter is not secure. Note this is FTPS as in FTP over SSL, not SFTP, which is used as an extension of the SSH protocol. SFTP is supported though, you enable it from the terminal settings instead. NFS is to Linux and Unix what SMB is to Windows, although Mac and Linux will support SMB as well. rsync and WebDAV can be used to back up or sync your NAS to another device or vice versa. One protocol that is notably absent is iSCSI. Unlike the others, this is a block-level protocol. It's used to share disks across the network rather than files. That's probably not a typical use case for a home NAS, but the sort of person who would use iSCSI at home is the sort of person who runs a home lab. The constraining factor for iSCSI is typically the speed of the network, and this does 10 gig, so if ever a prosumer NAS was built for iSCSI, it's this one. Ugreen did tell me they plan to release iSCSI support later this year. Let's take a look at the included apps. A lot of them need to be installed from the App Center as they are not enabled by default. This is a sensible approach, if not the most intuitive. In the IT world, it is considered good security practice to only run the services you actually require, but it makes the NAS feel a bit bare bones initially. The Cloud Drives app will let you sync files between your Ugreen NAS and OneDrive or Google Drive. There are various multimedia apps to turn your NAS into something of a media center. The Theater app, for example, is Ugreen's version of something like Plex or Jellyfin. Although it's worth noting, you can install actual Jellyfin as well. Personally, I've been using Jellyfin as my media center for a while now. Comparing that with the Ugreen apps, it was significantly easier to get up and running with Ugreen. Basically just install the app, select your media folder, and you're done. Although it was easier, and it had the main features I need from a media center, the experience was a little bit disjointed compared to Jellyfin. There are different apps for movies, music, and photos, and the experience differs between mobile and desktop. For example, using the mobile app, I can play a movie on my phone, cast it to another device, or if there's a TV attached to the HDMI port on the back of the NAS, play it to that. From the desktop app, I could only seem to play it to my local device, and I couldn't find any casting options on the music app at all. There's support to access the NAS as a media server using DLNA, but that's a separate app, and you have to define your media libraries in that again separately. I had mixed success using the various remote playback options. Playing to a TV via the HDMI port worked great. Casting to my admittedly fairly old Samsung TV didn't work, despite it appearing in the list several times. My Samsung speakers, on the other hand, found the NAS automatically and worked perfectly. That was a pleasant surprise because they're a bit temperamental and Jellyfin doesn't work properly with them. Overall, if I didn't already have Jellyfin set up, I would be happy enough to plug the NAS into my telly and use the Ugreen Theatre app for movies and the music app with my speakers. Having Jellyfin already in place, so there's nothing that would tempt me to switch. The Photos app includes AI features to automatically classify your photos, so for example you could find all photos with a particular person in them. There are a bunch of different models you can download as well as training your own. This all runs locally on your NAS, and from the limited testing I did with some family photos, the recognition of different people seems to work well. Other apps worth noting: Home Assistant is a very popular home automation tool, although I personally use OpenHAB. QBitTorrent for downloading your Linux ISOs. The Sync and Backup utility combined with the installable Ugreen apps basically lets you use your NAS as your own locally hosted Google Drive. It looks like the underlying technology is based on SyncThing, so Ugreen are building on an existing platform. It's definitely a lot easier to get set up using this app than something like Nextcloud, which is what I'm currently using. The Sync and Backup tool can be used to back data up to the NAS and also back up the NAS itself. If you have two Ugreen NAS devices, you can have them back each other up. This is not a backup tool on a par with something like Veeam. Don't expect image backups, bare metal recovery, or database-aware application consistency. This is just about putting a copy of your files in another place. That said, you could point Veeam at your NAS and use it as a backup repository. The two most important apps for me though are the Docker and Virtual Machine apps. The built-in app list is fairly small, but these two basically extend your options to infinity. The App Center has a list of 26 apps, but once I open Docker, I suddenly have access to a library of 2,500 additional apps. I suspect that's actually just the number at which it stops counting, because it's getting them from Docker Hub, and there are way more than 2,500 there. These are less point and click than the built-in apps. These are Docker containers, but they're considerably more point and click than building your own server from scratch. If you haven't used Docker before, it's pretty cool, but it's also one for the techies. If Docker isn't enough, then you can use the Virtual Machine app to install full instances of other operating systems within virtual machines on your NAS. You can install Windows or Linux in a virtual machine, meaning there's no limit to what you can run on it. You can do this on other NAS devices as well, but Ugreen's more capable hardware takes it from a NAS that can do some other stuff to more of a home lab in a box. I recommend budgeting for some additional memory if you go down this route, especially if you plan to run virtual machines. The included 8GB is fine for a NAS with a few containers, but once you start running a couple of Windows virtual machines, that is going to disappear quickly. Let's round off the UGOS software part of the video with a look at security, because if you're going to put your data on this device, the security matters. First up, there's an app called Security. That's an antivirus scanner. A useful inclusion, but nothing exactly groundbreaking. It just runs ClamAV. It would be nice to see Ugreen flex some of that AI muscle they've shown in the Photos app to implement some ransomware detection features. The NAS does support multi-factor authentication using TOTP codes via the usual authenticator apps, but it's not enforced by default. If you intend to use this device over the internet, make sure you enable this. Well done for having the option, Ugreen, but please be a bit pushier about prompting people to use it. You can also domain join your NAS to Active Directory or use LDAP. This isn't something most people will have at home. I mean, well, I do, but I'm weird. If you wanted to use this device in a small business sort of scenario, this would allow you to integrate it with your existing network user accounts, although I personally see it more as a prosumer tier device than a business device. If you want command line access to your NAS without plugging in a keyboard, you can enable Telnet or SSH. Telnet is not secure, do not use it. To give Ugreen credit, both of these are disabled by default, and it will warn you that Telnet is a bad idea. Personally, I just wouldn't have even included the option. Ugreen gets credit for some pretty good defaults here in the security section. Auto-blocking IPs with bad logins, HTTP headers enabled to combat cross-site scripting and forgery attacks, and a minimum transport encryption of TLS 1.2. You would not believe how many expensive enterprise applications do not enable these features by default. This comes up all the time as remedial actions in real-world penetration tests, so it's good to see Ugreen doing this out of the box. What I'm not so keen on is the default portal settings here, where the device defaults to the insecure HTTP protocol instead of HTTPS. There's no point having secure defaults for HTTPS if you're going to use HTTP anyway. Fix it by ticking this box. The warning here is the reason I suspect they don't enable it by default. If you enable an encrypted connection without having a publicly signed certificate on the device, your browser is going to flag the site as not secure. This is actually more secure though. It seems a bit backwards, but your browser makes less noise about unencrypted HTTP because it isn't expected to be secure in the first place. If you want this warning to go away, you can add a publicly signed and trusted certificate here using your own domain. How to do this is beyond the scope of this video, but it's a you thing. Ugreen can't do this for you. Security for the SMB file sharing protocol is okay out of the box, with at least secure options like SMB version 1 disabled, but it can be tightened up by enforcing signing, and I recommend doing so. For remote access to your NAS over the internet, there are two methods provided out of the box. The first is the Ugreen Link Remote Access, which requires you to sign up for a Ugreen account. The second is Dynamic DNS, which is combined with Universal Plug and Play. This doesn't require a Ugreen account, although it will require an account with a Dynamic DNS provider. I really do not recommend using this method. This removes the dependency on Ugreen, but it exposes your NAS directly to the internet. Lots of NAS devices have been hacked because they were exposed to the internet and a vulnerability was exploited. As far as I know, Ugreen hasn't been affected by this yet, but it's only a matter of time. Any company that tells you their software has no vulnerabilities would be lying. Because Ugreen NAS supports Docker and virtual machines, you can build your own secure remote access by deploying something like a reverse proxy, a web application firewall, a VPN, passkey authentication, etc. That's again beyond the scope of this video though. If you know what you're doing, this would be my recommendation. Deploy your own secure method of remote access. If you don't have the capability to design and implement this yourself, either keep access local or choose Ugreen Link and let Ugreen handle it for you. Closing off the security part of this video, I gave the NAS a scan using both Nessus and Greenbone. I enabled SSH, SMB and DLNA, disabled IP blocking, and ran an authenticated vulnerability scan as well as a web application vulnerability scan. Usually with the sort of devices that get sold to the general public, this tends to report back a whole raft of vulnerabilities and insecure configurations. In the case of this Ugreen NAS, there are no significant findings. A vulnerability scan is not a penetration test, but this does suggest that Ugreen is making an above average effort to secure their products, which is not something to take for granted in this industry. Running apt-update manually at the console did show a lot of updates available in the standard Debian repos though. Ugreen says you should only update via the Ugreen app. Don't make changes to system packages at the command line. That said, as long as you're not messing with installed system packages, it is kind of useful that you can install things using apt. I used this during my testing to chuck on a few command line diagnostic tools. This is not a supported thing to do, and if you mess with the wrong package, you could break your NAS. Overall, the Ugreen software will do the sort of stuff you expect from a NAS, and they don't appear to be half-arsing the security like a lot of consumer-grade kit. It's not the most comprehensive suite of tools, but it covers the common use cases, and it has one final trick up its sleeve. You don't have to run UGOS. Ugreen has developed this as a turnkey appliance, but if your requirements are more specific, you can install an alternative operating system. For example, if you want support for iSCSI and you don't want to wait for Ugreen to implement it, you could replace the Ugreen software with TrueNAS. You could install Windows or Linux or a virtualization platform like Proxmox. At the end of the day, if you ignore the software, what you're left with is an x86 computer with a bunch of drive bays, high-speed networking, and in a package that wouldn't look out of place on a bookshelf. If you had a few of these devices, you could build yourself a hyper-converged infrastructure at home. Ugreen will not be able to help with issues related to someone else's software, of course, but they have confirmed they will still honour the hardware warranty regardless of whose software you choose to run on it. This is a really important point in their favour, because of this. This is a NAS I had use of many years ago. I didn't have it for long though before I had to stop using it. It wasn't because it broke, as far as I know the hardware still works. It wasn't because it ran out of capacity. In fact, I took the disk out of this and continued to use it as direct attached storage for several years after. What happened was some serious software vulnerabilities were discovered and the vendor wouldn't fix them. This is not a unique situation. At some point, it will probably happen to this Ugreen NAS. The reason I believe so is because Ugreen doesn't charge a subscription. You pay a one-off price to buy a NAS from them. That's a good thing. I hate subscriptions. But if you're not paying an ongoing fee, you're not paying for infinite software development. At some point, it won't be viable for them to support old devices. When that happens, with some other NAS vendors, your options are to buy a new NAS or accept the risk to your data. Because Ugreen doesn't lock you into their software, you have a third option should this go end of life. Install a different operating system. This doesn't just expand the potential capabilities of this device, it effectively ensures its longevity and prevents it ending up on the scrap heap prematurely like this one. This, in my opinion, is one of the strongest points in Ugreen's favour. To do this, you'll need to plug in a keyboard and monitor and probably a mouse. Then to get to the boot menu, you need to hold Ctrl and F12 as the device is powering up. The first time you get here, you'll want to go to the BIOS and disable this Watchdog feature before doing anything else. The Watchdog checks to see if the Ugreen software is running. If it isn't, the Watchdog assumes that your NAS must have locked up and it will force a reboot to recover. It's a useful feature normally, but not so useful if you're not actually running the Ugreen software, because then it's just going to keep rebooting your NAS. The next thing I recommend doing is to make a backup of the original Ugreen operating system. I cloned the internal NVMe drive in this one using a Linux boot USB and the DD tool. At the time of recording, Ugreen does not provide a public download to reinstall UGOS Pro from scratch, but they have told me that if you bork your operating system and want to go back, you can get in touch with their support team, and they'll help you out with an install image and some instructions. Besides that, it's just like installing an operating system on any other computer. TrueNAS just worked. Proxmox just worked. Linux just worked. Windows needed network drivers, and then it just worked. It even has a TPM for Windows 11. Perhaps most surprisingly, VMware ESX worked, after a little tweaking. It only recognised the 2.5 GB Intel network interface and not the 10 GB Quantia interface, but honestly I was surprised it worked at all considering how picky VMware tends to be about hardware. So wrapping up, is this NAS worth your money? Well, that depends on what you want out of a NAS. If you don't particularly care about performance or customization, and you just want storage at the end of a network cable that works reliably with minimum fuss, the Synology DS423 is cheaper, and the software is very mature, although bear in mind whatever its replacement is will likely lock you into buying more expensive Synology drives. If on the other hand you want more performance, better overall value for money, you don't want to be locked into proprietary hardware or software, and especially if you view your NAS more as a gateway to home labbing and self-hosting than just storage, then Ugreen is going to take you further and deserves a place in your shortlist. Put another way, if I was buying a NAS for my parents to share family photos, they'd be fine with a low-end Synology. If I was buying a NAS for myself, then based on my experience here and considering the direction Synology is headed, I'd go for one of Ugreen's. This particular model seems to be on sale a lot at the moment. Obviously that might change, so I've just used the list price for the sake of comparison, but if you want to check it out, I'll have a link in the video description, or you can scan this QR code here. If you have any questions about something I've missed, please drop a message in the comments and I'll do my best to answer it, or share your own feedback if you've won these devices yourself. Speaking of sharing, sharing is caring, right? So like the video, share the video, and make this your next video. You don't even need a NAS to watch it on.